Hello, and welcome to the ConnectShip iShip Reach webinar series. My name is Jerry Dixon, and I will be hosting this international webinar today. Not too long ago, we brought you an international webinar on global trade compliance. In continuation of our international series, we want to move your focus onto two of the most critical global issues that we have ever had in the supply chain: General Data Protection Regulation and Brexit. These are two of the most important supply chain issues that we should be concerned about and prepared for. GDPR is in effect, and if you are not compliant, you could pay a steep price. GDPREU.org lists that lower level fines will be up to 10 million euro or 2% of the worldwide annual revenue of the prior financial year, or whichever is higher, and upper level fines will be up to 20 million euro or 4% of the worldwide annual revenue of the prior financial year, or whichever is higher. In US dollars, that is equivalent to over 13.1 million for lower level fines and over 26.3 million for upper level fines. Can your business afford that? How will Brexit affect your business? What is GDPR and how did it come about? These are important questions. ConnectShip iShip is proud to host this webinar with our global partner, Logistics International. And we are excited to have with us today Mark Nichols. He's the Managing Director at Logistics Technologies, who will lead us through the core elements of these topics. As the CEO of ConnectShip iShip partner, Pantechnic International, Mark was one of the architects of the merger of Pantechnic International, Agile Network, Advanced Distribution Systems Incorporated, or ADSI, and Agilis, to form Logistics Technologies Incorporated in 2017. Today, his responsibilities include the logistics business in Europe and Asia. Mark has had a long career in technology and media after reading law at University College London. Mark, welcome and thank you for being here. Let's get started.
Good morning. My aim this morning is to offer a perspective on two current developments which are of critical interest to shippers and shipping system providers operating within Europe and to some extent anyone who deals with European customers. The two changes I'll be focusing on are the impact of the EU's supranational data protection laws, known as GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulations, and Brexit, or Britain's exit from the European Union. Before we go into details, a bit of background to explain why all this matters, particularly to a US audience. Well, for a start, the European Union is the biggest trading partner of the United States. EU trade represents nearly 20% of total US international trade. It's also the world's largest trading bloc, with 28 countries and more than 500 million people, and another 4 countries are waiting to join. For all of that, the European Union is quite a recent construct. From its origins in post-war industrial regulation, the bloc, known as the European Economic Community when Britain joined in 1973, became the European Union in 1992. And at that stage, there were just 12 members. But the change from being an economic community to a union was key. It marked out the ambition of Europeans to become, to use a familiar phrase, an ever closer union, and it's probably the foundation of the Brexit issue we face today. So in 1993, the EU became a single market, internal borders disappeared in 95, and in 2002, the Union, with the exception of Britain and Denmark, adopted a single currency. For shippers, these advances have enabled the development of pan-European supply chains and the trend towards centralized European logistics hubs that can serve the entire market. In my personal experience over the last decade, I've watched customer after customer hone their supply chains, reducing sometimes 20 or more distribution centers to just 1 or 2 ELCs, supported by large numbers of carriers to ensure quality of supply for every region. Incidentally, I think it's no coincidence that all the major providers of shipping systems in Europe today can trace their origins back to that time. And that's a full 20 years after ConnectShip, then Tandata, and most US shipping systems. The culmination of this ever closer union might be more sophisticated distribution models, but it's also vast amounts of pan-European regulation. And that's responsible for the two key developments I want to discuss today. It's encouraged the European Commission to seek to regulate beyond the borders of the EU, but it's also been at the heart of the arguments for Britain to leave the Union. Let's look at that first by examining the impact of that data regulation, GDPR, introduced in May this year. As I say, borders are no limit here. GDPR applies to everyone, anywhere. If you have data on any European citizen, you're subject to GDPR. So let's just cover off the basics. Here are the core elements. First, the regulations require you to make sure you have consent to hold any personal data on European citizens and to ensure the individual, known in the regulations as the data subject, was properly informed of what data you hold and why you hold it. And by the way, personal data isn't just sensitive data. It includes names, addresses, emails, phone numbers, in fact, anything that can identify an individual. Next, no one should hold data for longer than they need to. And for shippers, I think this is a very critical requirement. No one can doubt it's legitimate to hold an address while you're shipping goods. But after you've shipped them, you can't reasonably claim that you still need that data. Thirdly, if you do lose data, you're now required to notify the authorities within 72 hours. Now, the GDPR regulations are the product of the European Commission, but the enforcement of them is in the hands of member states. So if a UK company has a data breach, it must report that to the UK Information Commissioner. For a US company, the position is far from clear. If it's operating in a particular European country, it can, of course, make the report there. But what if you're a US company shipping to Europe? The answer is not clear, but it's probably the state data protection agency, if there is one. Finally, there are the rights of data subjects. First, to know what data you hold on them, and second, to have it deleted, what is described as the right to be forgotten. To a large extent, the impact most people have felt from GDPR so far is websites emailing you to ask if they can continue to contact you. And with little being said about it, it's tempting to think that GDPR has gone away. The reality is, it's yet to start. Enforcement is on the way. To give an example, in the UK, the number of complaints regarding data protection breaches more than doubled just in the first month after GDPR came into force. And the story is similar across Europe. And given time to investigate, the likelihood is the first real penalties are going to start landing early next year. And those penalties can be severe, 20 million euros or 4% of global sales. And then there's the cleanup of reputations afterwards. By way of illustration, British Airways' recent data loss in the first week of September knocked more than 600 million euros off the value of its parent company, IAG. So let's look at what a shipper or shipping software provider can do to ensure they never end up there. First, don't keep data you don't need. Seems pretty obvious, but in my experience, software developers focus on capturing data and sometimes forget the need to develop purge routines. With respect to shipping, does the system need to retain the data after the items are shipped? Marketing and sales may well do, but does shipping? You may well have an address book, and maybe this should prompt the question as to whether that kind of data is really needed in multiple systems. If you do retain data, segment it, hash it out, get rid of the personally identifiable elements, the names, the phone numbers, the email addresses. And then there's the question of whose data is it? As a shipping systems provider, we've had customers come to us to ask us to sign GDPR contract amendments, confirming that we're following the regulations in detail. In response, I asked them not to give us personally identifiable data unless it is absolutely necessary, and then we make sure we'll delete it as soon as we can. And then this brings me to a key point for other system providers. Indemnities work both ways. If you're providing a shipping system, you are what the regulations call a data processor. Your client is the data controller. You're going to do everything you can to ensure you don't have a data breach. But have they done everything they can to ensure they're not storing any data for which they didn't have the user's consent? And finally, let's not forget about data transmission. There are still too many carriers in Europe that do not support encrypted transmission of manifests. If a client does ask you to work with them, make sure they're aware of that lack of security and check that indemnity. And the subject of data transmission brings us neatly on to my second topic, Brexit. Why? Because the departure of Britain from the European Union may mean that under GDPR, it will not be permitted to transfer data from one of the remaining EU 27 countries to the UK. The UK might be one of the founding fathers of data protection, having had laws on the subject since the early 80s. But it's for the European Commission to decide whether the infrastructure which is in place on the 29th of March next year will still be safe for data transmission the next day. Just one of the many politics trumps common sense issues that come up in the crazy world of Brexit. So nicely illustrated here by this graffiti from the British artist Banksy. Brexit is certainly the biggest issue of all facing European shippers right now. So what is going to happen? No country has ever left the European Union. Indeed, when the Union was being created, for some time they never even considered that a country would leave. So let's use that famous Donald Rumsfeld analysis to try and make sense of it. We'll start by seeing if there are any known knowns. This is the easiest one because, in fact, there are almost none. The UK might leave, it might not. It might happen on the 29th of March, 2019. It might happen on the 31st of December, 2020. That's when a proposed transition period, if it happens, will come to an end. And then again, it might never happen. There are a lot of people in the UK asking to rerun the vote from 2016. Deciding where things lie between these options is in the land of politics. And on that, I would just say this. Remember, there are not two parties here. There are 29. That's the UK, the remaining 27 EU countries, and the European Commission, or as everyone in Europe tends to refer to them as, Brussels. The Commission in Brussels has a big stake in it. The obvious fear there is that if the UK leaves successfully, others will follow, and then who's going to pick up their bill? For the individual countries, the effect is huge. Belgium has estimated they could lose 20,000 jobs just in the Flanders region. The Netherlands has 15% of its economy directly linked to the UK. Germany's largest market for its cars is the UK, and for France, the country is the largest market for its champagne. So, if there is one known known, it's this. This is a big change. Unfortunately, that is also probably the last known known. Let's turn then to what we don't know, those known unknowns. Here's a few of them. The first and most obvious is reporting of duties and taxes. At present, most, but not all, shipments within the European Union do not require reporting or payment of duties or taxes. It's hard to think that this will not change. At best, the regime could be as simple as that between, say, the EU and Norway, but in practice, it could be much more complex. And the inevitable follow-up is, of course, that a commercial invoice will be required for every shipment. For shipping from the US to Europe, those requirements are already there, but the next known unknown applies the same to US shippers as it does to anyone shipping within the EU. After Brexit, the carrier services you will use will be different. At present, services like UPS Worldies or DHL Breakbulk are not used for shipments within the EU, but they're very important for shipments to single countries outside of the Union. Similarly, if you're bulk shipping from the US to the UK and other European countries, after Brexit, these are likely to become separate shipping lanes with their own clearances. With these kind of changes, it's clear that the software managing your shipping process will need to change too, and it will need to change overnight. Because unless we hear different in the next few months, some of the shipping processes used on the 29th of March next year will be out of date the next day. So with Brexit fast approaching, the last and most important point is this: you need a plan. From my perspective, dealing with a number of major US corporations operating throughout Europe, my concern is that to date, only one has approached me on this. I expect and hope that will change and change quickly. So now then, let's turn to that last category, the unknown unknowns. And when I raised this with one of my colleagues who's worked with shipping software for a long time, he smiled and said, that's where you make the money. And I guess that's about all we can say on the topic right now. But for sure, there will be plenty of unknowns coming up to bite anyone involved in European shipping over the next 12 months. So let's summarize. If you deal with Europe, get ready for change. GDPR might have come into force in May this year, but its effects have yet to be felt. Enforcement is coming, and it will be expensive for those who have not prepared. And then there's Brexit. It's easier to say what we don't know than what we do, but for anyone doing business with the UK or any of the remaining EU 27, you can be sure life will be getting tougher. I hope this has been a useful presentation, and I look forward to trying to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Okay, our first question is, how do you process data deletion requests and how long does it take?
Hi, Jerry. Well, first, before I answer that, let me just put in a quick disclaimer. Obviously, the opinions in my presentation earlier are personal opinions and not those of ConnectShip, iShip, or of Logistics Technologies. Okay, data deletion requests for us should never arise because our issue is we would aim to delete all data from systems before that request comes about. I believe the GDPR regulations specify time periods that are available on the European Union website, but I don't have that number to hand of the number of days you have to respond to an individual on whom you're holding data.
So the second question is, how will Brexit impact a United States company shipping directly to countries in Europe?
I think I briefly touched on that in the presentation. In my view, I think that the main impact will be they will now be required, if they're bulk shipping to Europe, to see Europe as two separate shipping lanes. If they're currently shipping as in a single breakbulk type shipment, they'll now be required to split it into two, one for the EU and one for the UK. Now, as the largest e-commerce market, and particularly as the main English-speaking market in the European Union, I would imagine that a very large proportion of any direct e-commerce shippers shipments to Europe are in fact going to the UK. So I'm not sure, it would depend on the individual circumstances to how that would impact, but for industrial companies, those in the aftermarket parts business, that is certainly going to be a significant requirement. And over time, it is one area where things might become easier. Some while back, there was a dispensation that allowed e-commerce shipments under the value of $2,500 to come into the European Union without duties and taxes being imposed. That disappeared at some point in trade negotiations between the EU and the US. And it's just the sort of thing that the UK would be seeking to bring back in seeking a direct relationship with the United States, which is obviously for the UK very much its largest trading partner.
I have another question with GDPR data retention rules. How is the customer concern of maintaining the data for X number of days? Do we have general standard of data retention? A general
there are not absolute standards of that. Sorry, let me rephrase that. There are standards, but not absolute rules relating to data retention. You can retain data for as long as you, A, have the consent of the individual to retain that data, and B, have a need to retain the data. So if you obtain consent from the person to send their marketing messages, you can continue to do that until the person withdraws that consent. But you must make it clear to them how they withdraw that consent, and you have to do so in simple, plain language. In respect of a shipper, for instance, I mentioned this in the presentation. It's perfectly valid that you should hold a person's data in order to ship goods to them. But does the shipping system need to retain that data in an address book? After that, it's very unlikely that that would be deemed reasonable, even if there was consent to retain it within a marketing system.
Okay, that seems to be all of our submitted questions. Thank you, Mark, for sharing your knowledge once again, and thank you to everyone who joined us. Good luck and many successes to all of you. See you next time.